The thermometer outside Millbrook's general store read 18 degrees below zero, and it was only October. Henrik Larsson stood in his doorway, watching his neighbors hammer boards over cracking cabin walls while wind screamed across the prairie like something alive and angry. 3 families had already crowded into the church, their wooden homes surrendering to cold that felt almost personal in its cruelty. Behind Henrik, his earth shelter, the one they'd mocked for 6 months, calling it a grave for the living, held steady at 52 degrees without a fire burning. The same neighbors who'd laughed were now watching his chimney, noticing the absence of desperate smoke, wondering what they'd missed about the strange Norwegian who'd buried himself in the hillside. Henrik Larsson had arrived in Custer County on a scorching July afternoon in 1879, when the prairie grass stood tall enough to hide a man on horseback, and the horizon stretched so far it seemed to curve with the earth itself. He'd come from Minnesota with a weathered trunk, a set of carpenter's tools, and a land claim deed that entitled him to 160 acres of Nebraska soil. Under the Homestead Act, the settlement of Millbrook consisted of 11 families scattered across the rolling grassland, their cabins built from lumber hauled 40 miles from the nearest railroad town. When Henrik surveyed his claim, a gentle slope facing south with a spring-fed creek running along its eastern edge, the other settlers expected him to do what everyone did: order timber, raise a cabin, and plant wheat before the first frost. Instead, Henrik spent his first week walking his land with a surveyor's careful eye, examining the hillside's composition, testing the soil's clay content by rolling it between his fingers, and measuring the angle of the sun's path across the southern exposure. Thomas Brennan, whose cabin stood a mile west, rode over on the 4th day with a jar of his wife's preserves as a welcoming gesture. "You planning to build sometime this century?" Thomas asked with good-natured humor, watching Henrik crouch near the hillside, scraping at layers of earth with a flat stone. "Winter comes early out here. You'll want walls up by September." Henrik looked up, squinting against the afternoon sun. At 34, he carried himself with a quiet intensity that some mistook for unfriendliness. His hands were calloused from years of farm work in the old country, and his Norwegian accent shaped his English into careful, deliberate phrases. "I am building," he said simply. "Into the hill, not on top of it." Thomas's smile faltered. "Into it? You mean like a dugout?" The word carried the faint derision of someone describing a temporary shelter, something desperate homesteaders built when they couldn't afford better. "Those are for the first winter, Henrik. You'll want a proper cabin eventually." "This will be proper," Henrik replied, returning to his examination of the soil. "Proper for what is coming." Word spread quickly through Millbrook's tight-knit community. By Sunday service, the talk centered on the peculiar Norwegian who was digging himself a hole instead of building a home. Martha Brennan, Thomas's wife, expressed concern for Henrik's mental state. Robert Chen, whose family had emigrated from San Francisco, suggested someone should explain proper building methods to the newcomer. Even Pastor Whitfield, usually diplomatic in matters of personal choice, gently suggested that Henrik might want to reconsider. "The Lord helps those who help themselves properly," the pastor said after church, clasping Henrik's shoulder with paternal concern. "And proper shelter means walls that stand up to the wind, not walls that cave in on you." Henrik accepted their concern with polite nods, but continued his work. He'd survived 3 Norwegian winters where temperatures dropped to 40 below zero, where snow buried entire villages for months, and where families who underestimated nature's fury simply didn't see spring. The American prairie, for all its summer warmth, had a familiar taste in its wine, something sharp and warning that the comfortable settlers around him seemed not to notice. By mid-August, Henrik had excavated a rectangular chamber 15 feet deep into the hillside, leaving the southern face open like a great mouth. The work was backbreaking, requiring the removal of tons of earth, but the clay-rich soil held its shape beautifully, needing minimal support. He'd positioned the shelter to face away from the prevailing northern winds, and the southern exposure would capture what precious sunlight the winter offered. The real artistry came in the walls. Henrik cut thick blocks of prairie, sod densely packed, earth held together. by the intricate root systems of buffalo grass and stacked them 3 feet thick around the earthen walls, creating an insulating barrier that would hold warmth like a mother holds a child. He installed a proper door frame with double doors, creating an airlock entry. The roof, supported by cottonwood beams from the creek, consisted of more sod layers topped with clay, sloped to shed rain and snow. When neighbors rode by, they saw what looked like a grass-covered mound with a door, a shelter that belonged to prairie dogs, not people. Their laughter carried on the wind. September arrived with the kind of perfect weather that made people forget winter existed. Golden sunlight painted the grasslands amber, and the harvest promised to be generous. The Brennan family hosted a community gathering, and for the first time, Henrik accepted an invitation, hoping to build goodwill with his neighbors. The evening started pleasantly enough. Children played tag between the wagons while women spread quilts and unpacked food. The men gathered near Thomas's barn, discussing crop yields and the rumor that the railroad might extend a spur line closer to Millbrook within 2 years. "Henrik," Thomas called out, waving him over with genuine warmth. "Come settle a debate. Robert here claims wheat prices will hold through winter. I say they'll drop once the eastern harvest comes in." Henrik approached the circle of men, grateful for the inclusion. But as he opened his mouth to respond, James Morton, a barrel-chested man from Ohio who'd claimed the largest parcel in the area, interrupted with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Before we discuss wheat prices, maybe Henrik should tell us about his luxurious earthen palace," James said, drawing chuckles from several men. "I passed by last week. Quite the architectural achievement if you're a Badger." The laughter came easier this time, emboldened by James's prominent position in the community. Henrik felt his jaw tighten, but kept his voice level. "It will be warm in winter. That is what matters, warm." James snorted. "It'll be damp, dark, and smell like a root cellar. My cabin's got 2 rooms, glass windows, and a proper wood stove. That's civilization, Henrik. What you've built is regression." Thomas, sensing the conversation's edge, tried to redirect. "Different men, different methods. No harm in that." But James wasn't finished. "There's harm in setting a poor example. We're building a real community here, not a collection of holes in the ground. What happens when travelers pass through and see grown men living like animals? They'll think we're all backwards." Henrik met James's eyes steadily. "When travelers pass through in January, they will see who was wise and who was proud." The statement landed like a challenge. James's face flushed, and the jovial atmosphere evaporated. "Proud? I'll tell you what's proud: thinking you know better than everyone else. Thinking Norwegian winters taught you something we don't know about American ones. This ain't the old country, Henrik. Out here, we do things properly." The gathering ended early, with families packing up under a canopy of awkward silence. Martha Brennan pressed a cloth-wrapped loaf of bread into Henrik's hands as he prepared to leave. "Don't mind James," she whispered. "He's just particular about things." But the damage was done. By the following week, Henrik's earth shelter had become the community joke. Children made up songs about the mole man while playing. Women shook their heads when his name came up, pitying the stubborn foreigner who'd wasted his claim on foolishness. Even Pastor Whitfield, in a sermon about building one's house upon rock rather than sand, seemed to glance meaningfully in Henrik's direction. Henrik endured it silently, continuing his preparations. He installed a ventilation system using stovepipe chimneys that would draw fresh air in and let stale air out without losing heat. He sealed gaps with clay mixed with straw, creating an airtight seal. He built shelves into the earthen walls and laid a floor of flat stones mortared together, creating thermal mass that would absorb and radiate heat. In late September, he purchased a modest cast-iron stove from the general store. Albert Myers, the proprietor, raised an eyebrow when Henrik selected the smallest model available. "That little thing won't heat much more than a closet," Albert warned. "You sure you don't want something bigger?" "This will be enough," Henrik replied, paying with carefully counted coins. Albert wrapped the purchase, shaking his head. "Your funeral, I suppose. Though probably not. More likely you'll just freeze slowly." October arrived with unusual warmth, and the ridicule intensified. James Morton made a point of inviting neighbors to view his cabin's new additions: a second window, shelves crafted from fine pine, and a larger stove that radiated heat impressively. The unspoken comparison to Henrik's burrow was clear, but Henrik noticed things others didn't. The V-formations of geese flying south appeared 3 weeks earlier than the almanac predicted. Squirrels and rabbits gathered food with frantic intensity. The woolly bear caterpillars crawling across the prairie wore bands of black, far wider than their brown centers, an old sign of harsh winter ahead. Most telling was the wind. On clear nights, when Henrik stood outside his shelter, he could hear something in the northern gusts that made his Norwegian instincts prickle with recognition. It was the same sound he'd heard before the winter of 1871, when snow had fallen continuously for 6 weeks and temperatures dropped so low that trees split open with sounds like rifle shots. Henrik doubled his firewood supply, cutting and stacking cord after cord of dried cottonwood. He stored root vegetables in the coolest section of his shelter: potatoes, turnips, carrots, all carefully layered in sand. He dried meat and preserved what he could, working with the quiet intensity of a man preparing for siege. His neighbors saw the preparations and laughed harder. "Look at him," James said loudly at the general store, making sure Henrik could hear. "Storing up like we're facing the end times. It's Nebraska, not the Arctic Circle." Henrik said nothing, loading his supplies onto his cart and heading home. The thermometer dropped 30 degrees overnight on October 18th. People woke to frost so thick it looked like snow, and a northern wind that carried ice crystals sharp enough to sting exposed skin. By noon, the temperature had barely climbed to 25 degrees, unprecedented cold for mid-autumn. The settlement reacted with concern but not alarm. Thomas Brennan spent the day splitting extra firewood. James Morton's larger stove burned hot, consuming wood at an impressive rate, but keeping his 2-room cabin comfortable. Families checked their food stores and assured themselves that this was just an early cold snap, nothing more. Henrik lit his small stove for the first time, using just enough wood to take the edge off the chill. Within an hour, his earth shelter stabilized at a comfortable 55 degrees. The thick sod walls, insulated by layers of soil, held the warmth efficiently. He could maintain the temperature with minimal fuel, burning perhaps a fifth of what his neighbors required. The cold snap lasted for days. By the time it broke, several families had burned through a significant portion of their winter wood supply. When temperatures climbed back to a moderate 45 degrees, everyone breathed easier, treating the cold as an anomaly, a freak occurrence unlikely to repeat. Everyone except Henrik. He spent the warming period cutting more wood, his axe biting into cottonwood from dawn until dusk. Robert Chen, riding past on his way to town, paused to watch their relentless work. "Henrik, you've got enough wood there for 3 winters," Robert called out. "You're going to work yourself to death for nothing." Henrik straightened, wiping sweat despite the cool air. "Better to have and not need," he replied simply. "That cold snap spooked you," Robert said, not unkindly. "But it's over. The almanac says we're in for a mild winter overall. This was just bad luck." Henrik looked north, where clouds were massing along the horizon like a gathering army. "The almanac did not feel that wind," he said quietly. November began with deceptive calm. Temperatures hovered in the comfortable 40s, and several sunny days convinced the community that normalcy had returned. James Morton hosted another gathering, this time making a show of roasting meat on an outdoor spit, proving that winter had been exaggerated. "See," he announced to the assembled neighbors. "This is Nebraska weather, unpredictable but manageable." Some of us panicked over nothing. His eyes found Henrik, who stood at the gathering's edge. "And some of us are still hiding in holes, preparing for disasters that exist only in foreign imaginations." The laughter came easier now, comfortable and communal. Henrik was no longer just different, he was the community's cautionary tale, the proof that old world thinking didn't apply to American resilience. But on November 12th, the sky changed. Henrik woke before dawn to absolute stillness, the kind of silence that precedes violence. The air tasted metallic, and the northern horizon wore a color he'd seen only twice before, a peculiar greenish gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He spent the morning reinforcing his shelter's door seals and bringing his entire woodpile under the small overhang he'd built. By noon, the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees, and the wind began not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had opened a door to hell's frozen basement. The blizzard hit at 2 in the afternoon. It wasn't snow, it was a white wall that erased the world. Wind speeds that later reports would estimate at 60 miles per hour drove ice crystals horizontally, turning the air into sandpaper made of frost. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. The temperature plummeted to 5 below zero in less than an hour. Inside his earth shelter, Henrik felt the building shudder, but hold. The thick walls muffled the wind scream to a distant howl. His small stove, burning modestly, kept the interior at a steady 48 degrees. He lit a lamp and settled into his chair, listening to nature's fury spend itself against earth to solid to yield. A mile away, Thomas Brennan's cabin groaned under the assault. Wind found every gap between boards, turning the interior into a freezer despite the roaring fire. Martha wrapped their 2 children in every blanket they owned while Thomas fed wood into their stove as fast as it would burn, watching their carefully rationed supply disappear with terrifying speed. James Morton's larger cabin fared worse. The bigger structure offered more surface area for wind to exploit, and his pride and joy second window developed a crack, leaking cold like a punctured lung. His impressive stove consumed wood voraciously, but couldn't overcome the heat bleeding from his walls. By midnight, the interior temperature had dropped to 35 degrees despite the raging fire. The blizzard lasted 36 hours. When it finally exhausted itself, the prairie lay buried under 3 feet of snow, and the temperature had settled at a brutal 10 below zero. Henrik emerged from his shelter into a transformed world. Drifts had buried the prairie grass entirely, and his neighbors' cabins looked like ships frozen in an ice sea. Smoke poured from every chimney, desperate and continuous. He was strapping on snowshoes when he saw Thomas Brennan struggling through the drifts toward him, moving with the jerky desperation of someone past exhaustion. "Henrik," Thomas gasped, frost coating his beard. "We're out of firewood. Burned it all keeping the children warm." James and Robert, to everyone's burning through supplies 3 times faster than expected. He paused, pride and desperation warring in his expression. "Can you spare any? I'll pay you back in spring, I swear it." Henrik didn't hesitate. "Come. We will load your sled." The blizzard proved to be just the beginning. November bled into December with temperatures that rarely climbed above zero, and several more storms buried the settlement under snow that wouldn't melt until spring. The cold had a quality that went beyond mere temperature. It was aggressive, invasive, finding ways through walls that had seemed solid in autumn warmth. Henrik's earth shelter became an unintentional beacon of resilience. While every cabin's chimney poured smoke continuously, his small stovepipe released only modest wisps. While his neighbors burned through their wood supplies at alarming rates, he used less than a quarter of his stockpile. And while the thin-walled cabins radiated cold despite roaring fires, his thick earthen walls held warmth with stubborn efficiency. The first family showed up on December 3rd. Sarah and William Fletcher, their 2 children wrapped in insufficient blankets, stood at Henrik's door with shamefaced desperation. "Our cabin wall is leaking air something." "Terrible," William said, his voice rough with cold. "The wind's found a gap we can't seal, and we can't keep the place above freezing no matter how much wood we burn. Could we maybe stay here? Just until the cold breaks?" Henrik's shelter wasn't large, but it was warm. He made space, setting up bedrolls near his stove and showing William how the thick walls held heat that wooden boards couldn't match. That night, the Fletchers slept warm for the first time in a week, and their children stopped shivering. Word spread quickly. By mid-December, Henrik's earth shelter had become a refuge. Thomas Brennan brought his family during the worst nights, sleeping on Henrik's floor rather than burning through their remaining firewood, fighting a losing battle against cold that wooden walls couldn't stop. Robert Chen, whose cabin's foundation had shifted, creating gaps that let in wind like knife blades, spent 3 days in Henrik's shelter while a relative warm spell allowed him to make repairs. Even James Morton came, though pride made the journey almost physically painful. He arrived after dark on December 19th, when temperatures hit 20 to below zero, his face gray with cold despite the thick coat. "My stove can't keep up," he said simply, the admission like pulling teeth. "The walls. There's frost forming inside, on the interior walls. I don't understand how this is happening." Henrik welcomed him without comment or triumph. As James thawed near the modest stove, Henrik explained what he'd understood from the beginning. "Wood is dead," he said, running his hand along the earthen wall. "It doesn't hold warmth, only blocks wind and not well. But earth is alive, full of tiny spaces that trap air. Each layer insulates the next. The cold must travel through 3 feet of sod and soil to reach here. By then, it has no strength left." James looked around the shelter at its low ceiling, earthen walls, and modest stove and saw it with new eyes. This wasn't a primitive burrow. It was engineering, ancient and brilliant, perfectly adapted to the environment that had defeated his modern, expensive cabin. "You tried to tell us," James said quietly, "that night at Thomas's place. You said winter would show who was wise and who was proud." "I hoped I was wrong," Henrik replied honestly. "I wanted to be the foolish one." The winter continued its assault. January brought temperatures that dropped to 30 below zero for days at a time. Henrik's shelter remained steadily comfortable, requiring only periodic additions of firewood. His neighbors' cabins became barely habitable ice boxes, and the community developed an informal rotation. Families would spend the worst nights at Henrik's earth shelter, warming themselves before returning to their own homes during brief warm spells to preserve what they could. Pastor Whitfield, conducting Sunday services in a church so cold his breath froze mid-sermon, stood before his shivering congregation and spoke of humility and wisdom. "The Lord teaches us through many teachers," he said, not quite meeting Henrik's eyes. "Sometimes those teachers come from unexpected places, speaking unexpected truths. Pride insists we know best. Wisdom listens, learns, and adapts." By February, Henrik's woodpile, once mocked as excessive, had been shared with virtually every family in Millbrook. His store of food, carefully preserved and rationed, had supplemented neighbors' dwindling supplies. His earth shelter had provided warmth during the coldest nights, when wooden cabins simply couldn't maintain livable temperatures no matter how much fuel they burned. The settlement survived, but barely. 3 families gave up their claims and left for warmer climates. As soon as the first thaw allowed travel, others, like Thomas Brennan, stayed but made plans to rebuild using different methods. "I'd like your help," Thomas said one evening, sharing coffee in Henrik's warm shelter while wind howled outside. "Come spring, I want to build a new cabin partially underground, with thick earth walls on 3 sides, wood only for the south-facing front. Will you teach me?" Henrik nodded. "I will. But it is not just about building. It is about listening to the land, to the seasons, to what nature teaches." James Morton, transformed by winter from the settlement's loudest voice to one of its quietest learners, added his own request. "I want to help. With the building, I mean. I've got timber and tools, but—" He trailed off, the admission difficult. "But I don't have the knowledge. I thought I did, but I was wrong." "Then we will learn together," Henrik said simply. The winter finally broke in late March, when the sun climbed high enough to begin melting the accumulated snow. As water trickled across the prairie and the first green shoots pushed through retreating drifts, Millbrook took stock of what the season had taught. 5 cabins had suffered serious structural damage from the extreme cold. Cracked foundations, warped boards, and broken windows that would require significant repair or complete rebuilding. The community's collective wood supply had been decimated, requiring months of cutting to replenish. Several families faced summer work requirements just to replace the food they'd burned through during the siege. Henrik's earth shelter emerged from winter virtually unchanged, having provided steady warmth with minimal resources throughout the entire ordeal. On the first Sunday warm enough for outdoor gathering, Pastor Whitfield organized a community meal, part celebration of survival, part acknowledgement of lessons learned. Tables were set up outside the church, and for the first time since autumn, people gathered without layers of wool between them and the world. James Morton stood and raised his cup, the gesture carrying weight of transformation. "I want to say something," he announced, drawing the community's attention. "Last fall, I made a fool of myself. I mocked a man who understood things I didn't. I called his wisdom primitive and his caution paranoia." He turned to Henrik. "You saved lives this winter. My life, my family's lives. Without your shelter, without your stored food and your shared wood, some of us wouldn't have made it. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." The apology hung in the spring air, simple and honest. Henrik stood and clasped James's extended hand. "You were not wrong to want good things for your family," Henrik said. "Only wrong about what good means in this place. We both know better now." The gathering became a planning session. Thomas Brennan spread drawings on a table, rough sketches of a new cabin incorporating earth shelter principles. Robert Chen added his own ideas about orientation and insulation. Even Martha Brennan, who'd initially called Henrik's shelter unnatural, contributed thoughts about efficient interior layouts. "We're starting a new tradition here," Pastor Whitfield observed, "studying the collaborative designs, taking the best of what we brought from our old homes and combining it with what this land teaches us. That's how real communities grow, not by clinging to what we knew, but by adapting to what we discover." Over the following weeks, the settlement transformed. Henrik taught willing students the art of sod cutting, the geometry of proper earth shelter excavation, and the importance of thermal mass. Thomas Brennan's new home took shape, a hybrid structure, with earth-burned walls on 3 sides and a south-facing timber front, combining the warmth-holding capacity of soil with the light and ventilation of traditional construction. James Morton worked alongside Henrik, learning through labor. One afternoon, as they cut sod blocks for Thomas's walls, James paused to wipe sweat from his face. "You know what's funny? I spent my whole life thinking progress meant leaving behind old ways, building taller, bigger, fancier. But this," he gestured at the half-finished earth-burned cabin, "this is what real progress looks like, understanding what works and having the humility to change." "Not funny," Henrik replied, trimming another sod block with practiced precision. "Human. We are all human. We learn through pain when we refuse to learn through listening." By May, Millbrook had transformed from a collection of isolated cabins into a collaborative community united by shared survival. For families had rebuilt using earth shelter principles. Others reinforced existing structures with additional insulation and wind barriers. Wood supplies were communally managed rather than hoarded, and knowledge was shared freely rather than guarded. The settlement's physical transformation reflected a deeper change. Pride had given way to pragmatism, and competition had evolved into cooperation. The winter had been brutal, but it had forged something valuable: a community that valued wisdom over appearances, preparation over complacency, and collective survival over individual pride. Henrik stood on his hillside one evening in late May, watching the sun set over the greening prairie. His earth shelter behind him had become more than just his home. It was proof that listening to land and season yielded better results than forcing preconceptions onto an environment that played by its own rules. Thomas Brennan rode up, his horse picking its way through the spring grass. "Wanted to thank you again," Thomas said, dismounting. "My family's moving into the new place tomorrow. Earth walls, proper ventilation, thick insulation, everything you taught us. It might not be what I imagined when I came to Nebraska, but it's what works here. That is all that matters," Henrik replied. "Not what we imagine, but what works." Thomas was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "You know, half the county's heard about the Norwegian who built the warmest house in Nebraska using dirt and grass. We've had visitors from 3 other settlements asking to see your shelter, wanting to learn. You're becoming famous." Henrik shook his head with mild amusement. "Not famous, just warm." But as words spread through the county and beyond, Henrik found himself teaching more than building techniques. He taught humility, the willingness to admit when conventional wisdom didn't fit unconventional circumstances. He taught observation, the importance of reading land and sky for information that no almanac could provide. And he taught preparation, the understanding that anticipating challenges was not paranoia, but responsibility. By the time autumn arrived again, bringing the first frost and the first test of the newly rebuilt homes, Millbrook was ready. The settlement that had mocked earth shelters now depended on them. The community that had valued appearance over function now understood that true strength often hid beneath humble surfaces. And when the first snow fell in November earlier than expected, but no longer surprising, Henrik sat in his earth shelter, warm and comfortable, listening to the wind test walls that would not yield. Around him, neighbors slept safely in homes built on principles he'd carried from another land and another people, proving that wisdom has no borders and survival respects no pride. The winter came hard, but Millbrook stood firm, built on earth and humility and the hard lessons that only nature can teach.